Welcome back to your regularly broadcast sleepy trivia session. Who can resist the cozy comforts that nostalgia brings, reminding us of a simpler time brimming with innocent youth? The Super Nintendo conjures the coziest memories of all, so we've gathered a whole hour of SNES facts for you all to enjoy that should get you dozing off in no time. You could call it the SNES, because we're about to take you down to Sleep Town. You know, when the Super Nintendo first released in Japan, known of course as the Super Famicom over there, it was actually a rare object, thanks to the meager supply that was available on the market. It was so hard to get hold of, in fact, the Nintendo had to implement a lottery system for their own employees to try and create some reasonable manner in which the console would be distributed to its own staff. You'd imagine that the more revered higher-ups at the company would be granted an immediate win, but Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of the little-known Nintendo series Super Mario, and Yuji Horii, the creator of the Dragon Quest franchise, were only able to secure one system each. The prospect of Nintendo entering the 16-bit generation was tantalizing, and gamers were excited to see how Nintendo would reinvent their existing franchises for the new, beefy system. One prospect that excited many was getting a new installment in the massively popular Legend of Zelda series. A Link to the Past certainly made use of what the SNES had to offer, introducing tons of new gameplay mechanics, story elements, and items such as the Master Sword. Demand for the game was high, and Nintendo made sure as many fans could get their hands on it as possible by translating the game into several languages, which brings us back to the Master Sword. The sword would have its name slightly altered across the various languages. Most versions still resembled the Master Sword name, but one localization decided to forge its own path. In France, the sword is named after perhaps one of the most legendary swords of all time, King Arthur's Excalibur. The sword's name would be changed in Ocarina of Time to remove the reference, now being called Épée de Légende, or Sword of Legend. The Excalibur name wasn't gone entirely, however, as the name somehow found its way back into future French releases of The Wind Waker and even Twilight Princess. As a mistake, perhaps? Who knows? But from Skyward Sword onwards, the iconic weapon would go on to just be known as the Sword of Legend in the French releases. Nintendo's other SNES big hitter, on the other hand, Super Mario World, had one issue that wasn't about language variations or creative license, but a programming faux pas. The game is of course continually referenced for its incredible gameplay, but one element that's often overlooked, perhaps because it isn't really all that important in the grand scheme of things, is the player's score that appears on screen at all times. Because of a staggeringly inefficient coding method, this score uses up a huge volume of the console's resources just to be displayed. In the case of the player having an, of course, highly unlikely score of 9,999,990, up to 16.5% of the computational power of the Super Nintendo is used to display these digits on every frame rendered. Most digital devices utilize binary to store numeric values, which are then grouped into 4 sets of binary digits for the sake of convenience, resulting in hexadecimal digits. When the device then displays a decimal number, it has to convert the number from its internally stored hexadecimal value into decimal form so that it can easily be read by humans. In most cases, this is a key step of coding, with strong code optimization being put in place so that it can be computed with supreme ease. The SNES actually has these optimizations built into its internal routines, but they have a top value of 65,536, meaning any number larger than this would have to be manually converted from hexadecimal into decimal and then displayed. This means that the larger score values of Super Mario World cannot rely on the internal optimized routine, and the game must manually convert these scores instead of relying on the SNES hardware to do so, and thus a dedicated algorithm has to be invoked to convert the huge values that a player's score can reach. A logical way for somebody to program this operation would be to only calculate the score's display whenever the value changes, and store the individual decimal digits in memory so that if the score is displayed on a frame where it hasn't been changed, it just recalls the data without performing a new calculation. However, instead of doing this, Super Mario World calculates the decimal value of the internal hexadecimal score on every frame, without even trying to determine if the score has changed. This means that the game's programming must compute every digit of the score separately, subtracting powers of 10 from the total, meaning the higher the player's score, the more processing power is used. And if that weren't bad enough, if you happen to be playing as Luigi, there's a huge oversight where the game will continually try to work out Mario's score on every frame as well as Luigi's. The game doesn't even display Mario's score and just discards it in the following frame. The developers failed to remove the code that computes Mario's score during Luigi's turn, and just added an identical routine to calculate Luigi's score on top of it. But it's not all bad. Mario World has an interesting optimization, in a sense, with the blue Koopas that launch themselves off of slopes. While these Koopas appear to demonstrate the game's physics, which allow Mario to crouch on a slope, gain momentum as he slides down, and then fly off a lip at the end, they actually don't do this at all. Visually, the same effect is achieved, but instead, the programming simply has the Koopas fake such physics by jumping whenever they hit an upward slope. This is only the case for the blue Koops that spawn into a level without a shell, while the others that were spawned in a shell will behave as normal. Shellless Koopas appear in a few courses, but only Cookie Mountain and Groovy include the necessary ramps that allow them to demonstrate their jumping behavior. There are some other one-off oddities in Super Mario World, such as Chocolate Island 4 and its starting position. While the player is expected to begin this stage by sliding down the initial slope and heading to the right, if they instead head up the slope and jump into the corner of the small space at the top, they actually take damage instead. This is the only place in the entire game where this behavior occurs, and the reason for why has not yet been explained. Rooms which include horizontally sliding blocks have their own strange behavior too, granting Mario an additional skill with his cape spin. Performing a cape spin while obtaining an item dropped from the player's reserve box will increase the area of effect of the attack, resulting in the ability to hit enemies at a great distance. You may have noticed this has nothing to do with the horizontally sliding blocks, and you'd be right in your assessment, but this glitch only occurs in areas with these blocks in place, and we don't really know why. There's another aspect to Mario World that most people probably haven't noticed either. A unique detail that, despite being clear as day since release, is exceptionally easy to overlook. While underwater, if the player holds down A or B, Mario will actually breathe harder than usual. Clearly, Mario must be exerting more air from performing actions, because the number of air bubbles that escape his mouth are increased, releasing at a faster rate. Let's move on to a Mario title that gave Yoshi a chance to shine, Super Mario World 2. Looking at the development files for this follow-up, it's possible to unearth some very unexpected sprites which can't be seen in the final product, razor blades. It appears as though these blades would have been used as some sort of enemy projectile directed towards the player. It's no surprise, of course, that these may have been considered a tad inappropriate. Razor blades don't really fit the light-hearted nature of Yoshi's Island, and could lead to some serious consequences if children were to try and imitate what they saw in the game. One behavior in Yoshi's Island is so unlikely to happen, we wouldn't blame you for thinking it was cut content. While bumpties can obviously bump into Yoshi, they don't actually deal any damage, and function more as an annoyance than a hazard. However, if Yoshi is hurt by a different enemy or obstacle and a bumpty is on screen, it will run towards and attempt to snatch Baby Mario in a similar fashion to the bandit enemy. Out of the entire Yoshi series of games, this is the only instance where bumpties are known to behave in this manner. It's also extremely rare to witness this interaction, as there's only a few instances where both bumpties and obstacles that can deal damage are close enough together to trigger the behavior. Strange reactions from enemies are a dime a dozen with this game though, like this particular behavior from a Shy Guy. If a Shy Guy is hit with an egg on the exact same frame as when a falling chomp's sound effect happens to end, rather than the Shy Guy being destroyed as normal, it will instead turn upside down and simply slide away. Yoshi can also get in on the glitch action and cause himself far more grief than any enemy could, though only in the most specific of places. To see it for yourself, simply go to level 5-5 near the helicopter bubble, then let Yoshi get hit and lose Baby Mario. When the timer reaches 0, have Yoshi lick Baby Mario's bubble and then immediately begin transforming into a helicopter. While in his helicopter form, the Goonies will appear and attempt to take Mario away. Now, if you quickly open the start menu and use a 20-star item, Mario's timer will be increased by 20 seconds. This will make Mario return to his bubble and the Goonies will flee the scene. All seems normal at this point, but the bubble is not as it seems. Touching it with Helicopter Yoshi will cause the bubble to pop and place Baby Mario in a significantly smaller bubble that doesn't even manage to cover his whole body. When Yoshi returns to his normal state after the transformation time runs out, Baby Mario will be stuck in this small bubble, and Yoshi will be given the opportunity to eat him. A fate perhaps worse than death, but not just for Mario it turns out, but Yoshi too, as without Baby Mario in tow, the stage cannot be completed, and the only solution left for Yoshi is to take a dive down a pit and lose a life. Speaking of diving down pits, this is something we all must do to witness the tragic tale of the decorative birds found in World 5 Stage 7. 3 decorative birds can be seen on this stage, which can only be witnessed if the player is fast enough in reaching them. They can be seen in the corner of the screen briefly, and their destiny has been programmed. After spawning in, they do nothing but simply hurl themselves downwards towards the bottom of the screen, and then to their own inevitable death. Brutal. Oft unseen brutality isn't limited to Yoshi's Island, it even comes up in Yoshi's Safari. Early in the game's development, it seems the team weren't all too concerned about violence being on show. A surprising take for a game aimed at children, and involving Mario wielding a gun. During the notorious data leak that Nintendo suffered in 2020, known online as the Giga Leak, unused graphics were found that show Yoshi's nose bleeding in an animation that plays after he takes damage. This was unsurprisingly taken out before release, but let's roll on with Yoshi's vibes a little bit longer, shall we? It's well known these days that Tetris Attack wasn't always a Yoshi title. The game is a reskin of a Japanese puzzler, Panel de Pont, which featured a unique cast of characters. When the game was brought to English audiences, the cutesy graphics were given a Yoshi-themed makeover so it would be more appealing to Westerners. But it seems Nintendo originally wanted something more killer before settling on Yoshi. As reported on a number of occasions by the British outlet Nintendo Magazine System, Nintendo allegedly approached Rare to localize the game for the West, hoping to replace Panel de Pont's characters with those of the Killer Instinct series. But, speaking from experience, old British magazines used to print any old shite if it led to more copies being sold. So, to unearth more details, and see if the rumours are even true, we reached out to Kev Bayliss, character designer, artist, game designer and more for the original Killer Instinct, as well as the producer for Killer Instinct 2 and Gold. We asked Kev if he knew anything about Nintendo's alleged proposal. Kev told us, "I don't remember anything about that, but it could be something that was going on in the background while I was focusing on KI. I imagine it's something we never got involved with after having become Donkey Kong Country focused, and perhaps it may have been too late in the SNES's life to be lucrative. It sounds like it would have been towards the end of that era, and we may have been entering into N64 development." Based on this, it seems like the KI localization may have just been an idea that never bore fruit. Kev was heavily involved in the series' design and art, and he'd most likely be involved or at least know about any other KI projects going on at Rare, so we're fairly confident in saying nothing substantial was ever done on a KI-themed Tetris Attack, if it existed at all. Perhaps the game's dialogue would have worked better with the rather more serious tones of Killer Instinct, however, as the final result of the English translation didn't seem to take into account that the dialogue would now be attributed to Yoshi in place of Lip from the original Panel de Pont, resulting in dialogue that does not fit Yoshi's more chilled out and friendly personality. Instead, Yoshi comes across as a stoic, strong fantasy hero with lines like, "Together, we own our world," and "We can't just be strong, we must be the strongest." Regional differences are ever present in Super Nintendo titles, and the classic SNES racer Stunt Race FX has its fair share, along with some interesting references to boot. In Japan, the game was released under the significantly more interesting name Wild Tracks, and with a far cooler logo. But this game is more than a pretty face, or a dull face depending on the region. It has some pretty slick references to another 3D-centric first-party Nintendo title, Star Fox. Throughout the game, billboards can be seen which feature cameo appearances from the likes of Fox McCloud, as well as Kirby, Mario and Luigi. This is cool of course, but it's just the tip of the iceberg for Star Fox cameos. In the Sky Ramp track, it's possible to see R-Wings flying around the stage as if performing an airshow for the audience. But there's even more to their cameo in the Night Cruise track. Here, bumping into one of the stage's first 3 Star Fox billboards will summon an R-Wing that will assist the player by dropping a boost power-up in front of them just before the stage's final turn. Going back for a second, we mentioned regional differences, and one of those differences can be seen here. Players from the PAL region might have guessed already that these Star Fox billboards were also changed between localizations. In the PAL region, which includes all of Europe and Oceania, and a good chunk of South America, Africa, and Asia, Star Fox was released as Star Wing. This name change was taken into account in Stunt Race FX, and as such, the game's cameo billboards were altered. The European release even added a new acknowledgement to the game's credits, making it the only release of Stunt Race FX that gave proper recognition to Argonaut Software for their assistance with the game, and their contributions to the creation of the graphics chip that made the game possible. We've already dabbled in it, so we might as well dive into Star Fox. During the development of the first game in the series, character designer Tighe Imamura hadn't initially wanted to make the characters anthropomorphic animals, and was pretty much set on making all characters your typical humans or aliens, sort of like F-Zero. But Shigeru Miyamoto convinced him that it would be better to use animal characters for the final game, as he wanted to have the game's aesthetic stand out from all the other science fiction properties popping up at the time. When it comes to other characters from the series, it wasn't until Star Fox 64 that players would see the debut of Star Wolf Team, a rival squad to the Star Fox heroes. This was not always intended to be the case, however. Their original debut was set for Star Fox 2, which wouldn't be seen for 20 years after its original cancellation and its miraculous release on the SNES Classic in 2017. Star Fox 2's official release version revealed a peculiarity with the cast of the Star Wolf Team. While many members of the team were present, such as Wolf O'Donnell, Pigma Dengar, and Leon Pawalski, one member is clearly missing: Andrew Oikoni, Andros' nephew. In place of his position in the team is what appears to be a lemur-based character with the name Algae, described within Star Fox 2's online manual as being rumoured to be the most devious creature in the cosmos. Adding to the character's mystery, though, is that Andrew had actually been initially conceived for Star Fox 2, as evidenced by concept art drawn by Imamura, which portrays him alongside Wolf, Leon, and Pigma. There's even evidence that Algae was referred to as Andrew within the game's data, even in this final release build, making it even more clear that Andrew was intended to be in the game before being changed out for Algae. With this in mind, it's worth noting that while Takeya Imamura was deeply involved in the development of the first Star Fox and all future games like Star Fox 64, he had very little to do with Star Fox 2 besides the previously mentioned concept art, and a small part in the playtesting of the game and advising on some small aspects of the title towards the end of development. In fact, he's only listed in the game's credits with a special thanks. In Imamura's place, another Nintendo staffer named Masanao Arimoto took over from his previous duties of designing the game's characters and sprites, which leads us to make some comparisons between the game's final sprite work and the original concept art. It's clear that Arimoto took a lot of creative liberty with the designs he was given, with these original concepts looking closer to the Star Wolf characters that would finally be shown in Star Fox 64. It seems as though after Imamura returned to take the helm as art director with Star Fox 64, Algae would wind up being reverted back to his original design for Andrew Oikoni. Let's jump back over to Mario for a bit and take a look at the granddaddy of remakes, Super Mario All-Stars. Both the All-Stars and NES versions of Super Mario Bros. 3 contain a coding oversight that can be triggered without the use of any codes and involving Mario touching both an enemy and a fire flower at the same time. If this happens, he will, for some reason, briefly turn into Frog Mario. For the game's GBA re-release, however, rather than fixing this glitch, here the glitch has merely changed. Now Mario will turn into two small Marios instead. The All-Stars version has another Double Mario oversight, this time triggered by the almost impossible action of the player pressing two conflicting buttons at the same time. While controlling Frog Mario, if the player somehow manages to press both left and right at the same time, Mario may turn into what appears to be two small Luigis for a single frame, though in actual fact this is two small Marios coloured green, likely because the sprites are utilising the frog suit palette. Let's go on to Donkey Kong Country now, and some curious instances within. Some players may have noticed that there are some audibly similar instances of music in this game. Of particular note, the opening to Gangplank Galleon theme. This little ditty is actually based on the title and menu theme featured in an earlier Rare title, the NES version of Sid Meier's Pirates. This game was also composed by the wonderfully talented David Wise, go figure. When Rare began their development on DKC, Nintendo had sent them some initial designs to use as guidelines from which they would be required to use as a basis for their own version of Donkey Kong. Within these early documents was one piece of art that showed a design for Donkey Kong that had him wearing a tie with a heart pattern, a design that wouldn't be seen after these initial sketches. The final game has a fair share of odd glitches relating to the deaths of the Kongs. If a Kong happens to be throwing a DK barrel, but at the same time the player exits the stage before the barrel has had a chance to hit the ground, the next time said Kong is hit by an enemy, they won't die. They'll instead freeze in place, maintaining a shocked expression forevermore. Diddy Kong also has quite the opportunity for a rather animated death. The animation in question plays when Diddy Kong loses a minigame, showing him throwing his hat on the ground and stomping on it. In the tanked up trouble level, it's possible to cause this animation to play while standing next to the edge of a ledge, resulting in Diddy Kong throwing his hat into the abyss below, followed by jumping in after it, dying in the process. One of the ideas thought up for Donkey Kong Country was that Donkey Kong would have a stash of bananas that he's hoarding. Now, bananas are quite notorious for their behavior in spoiling immensely quickly. The idea of a banana hoard such as this is of course highly illogical, as it wouldn't last all too long. But fear not, the logic has all been explained rather succinctly and perfectly by an official 1995 British comic. Here, it is revealed that the banana hoard is in fact insusceptible to spoiling because the banana hoard cave that they're stored in has magical preserving properties, obviously. Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy Kong's Quest, masterfully built upon its predecessor, but it also had some quirky moments that surely weren't intended. One example is that of a clobber enemy who drops into the lava but doesn't actually die. Instead, the enemy is teleported to such a high spot vertically that it takes a full 3 minutes for it to fall back into view. If the player hangs around in the same spot where the clobber fell into the lava, 3 minutes later, a clobber will fall from the sky, usually bonking the player in the process. Another pretty horrendous glitch, to be fair, can occur with Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. If the player boots up the game on the original Super Nintendo hardware, there is a chance, albeit an exceptionally small one, that Donkey Kong Country 3 will accidentally misidentify itself as being an illegitimate copy, resulting in a screen appearing which reads, "An irregularity has been detected. Please turn the power off, wait 10 seconds, and then turn the power on again." This is because DKC3 will run tests on boot up to see if it's a pirated copy or not. However, the RAM in the original SNES hardware will be randomized when booting the game, resulting in a small chance of triggering a false positive and misidentifying itself as an illegitimate copy. The problem is often resolved by doing as the screen says and turning off the console for 10 seconds before booting the game back up. There's another glitch in the game that goes down at the beginning of the tracker barrel trek, but requires a rather precise bit of execution. On a very specific spot, if the player switches from Dixie to Kiddy Kong, Kiddy will immediately fall through the ground and die. Let's dive into another beloved Nintendo title that stood out by using pre-rendered graphics. Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars was a smash hit with fans on its original release, and went on to be widely revered as a top-tier RPG, garnering such a strong reputation worldwide despite its lack of release outside of Japan and the United States. At least fans across the globe who didn't have a chance to play it on the SNES would finally get to do so with the game's remake on the Switch, though not all remained the same between the SNES and its Switch counterpart. A number of pop culture references that were inserted into the original English release wound up being removed for the remake. Mallow previously would mention Bruce Lee prior to him and Mario going to fight Bowser. Punchinello no longer references James Bond or The Thing during his boss fight, as well as Mini Goomba's Thought Peak no longer referencing Theodore Roosevelt's aphorism, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." Stinger's Thought Peak was also altered so that it would no longer reference the 1990s Madonna song, Vogue. The password clues found in the sunken ship were also no longer written in such a way that they were credited to real-world famous explorers. While there isn't exact reasons given as to why these were changed, in many instances, it's easy to assume that references to entities such as Bruce Lee were removed to avoid licensing issues, or antiquated references that younger players may not understand. Earthbound was another popular SNES RPG which once again saw popularity across the globe despite having a release limited to Japan and NTSC audiences, never having reached PAL territories on the SNES. There were some key differences between the Japanese and American releases though, with the game's dialogue being reworked for practically every release, even long after the original game's publication. In the Japanese game, when Master Barf challenges the party to combat, he exclaims, "Get covered in puke and die." When this was translated for an English localization, it was adjusted slightly to read, "Drown to death in puke." Still disgusting, of course. The game would be released again further down the road as part of Mother 1+2 on the Game Boy Advance, as well as being featured within Super Mario Bros. Brawl as a demo within the Masterpieces menu. In both versions, the line was softened slightly to take out the notion of death, saying in Japanese, "Suffer until you vomit." Disgusting, but certainly not quite as graphically gross. What makes this change interesting though, is that in the case of Super Smash Bros. Brawl's Masterpiece release, it would have been impossible for the player to even reach this dialogue, as the demo version is limited to a very short timer that wouldn't be anywhere near long enough to reach this point in the adventure. Once more, the line would be changed for the game's release on Virtual Console, meaning the Brawl demo was not the same as the Virtual Console build. A release which changed the line to something that is arguably even worse than what came before. Get covered in me and suffer. This isn't the only part of the game that would be revised. After beating Carpenter, rescuing Paula and returning to Tucson, there is a character who will say, "I heard that you, Paula, beat up the kidnapper. You're my favourite." A pretty encouraging affirmation. In Japan though, this same character actually states, "Paula, I heard you kicked the kidnapper's balls off. You're amazing." No mention of being his favourite in any way. When released in the Double GBA pack and Brawl, the term balls was changed to vital spot, while the Virtual Console release would go for the slightly more broad term crotch. A personal favourite RPG of this channel, unsurprisingly, is Chrono Trigger. It truly represented the best of the best for the Super Nintendo, and for many, it was the best work to come out of the studio that birthed many of the greatest RPGs of all time, Squaresoft. One musical track, despite not even appearing in the game itself, is truly magnificent. Singing Mountain is a musical piece that would only be released on the game's official soundtrack album in 1995, before eventually making its way to the game's DS release. However, some gamers may have heard the song elsewhere before hearing it attributed to Chrono Trigger. The track actually appeared in 2003's Game Boy Advance version of The Hobbit, where it is known as the Magic Music Box, having clearly been plagiarized from Squaresoft's original work. Naughty naughty. Chrono Trigger was widely praised when it initially released, and Game Informer's review of the game was similarly full of appreciation for the game's quality. The magazine was so keen to promote the game that they wished to include it as a full cover spread, featuring exclusive custom artwork from the game's artist Akira Toriyama. Squaresoft had agreed to the deal, but just a week before the magazine issue was set to be published, the company informed Game Informer that Toriyama had decided not to create the work as he feared it would wind up being sold on the black market, as his drawings had become incredibly valuable. As such, the front page spread feature was given to Lunar the Silver Star instead. We've just mentioned a couple of RPGs that never had a PAL release, so how about a game that never received a release in the United States? Terranigma is a game that was released in Japan and PAL territories exclusively, and not in the US. In the game's original Japanese release, players could take part in a quiz with a guy that must be saved from a ghost in Neo Tokyo. After rescuing him and then talking to him in the General Affairs divisions inside the Quintet building, he would ask a series of 18 questions, which, if answered correctly, would reward the player with a Magirock. In all European versions of the game, however, this quiz minigame was removed, and the Magirock prize would instead become completely unobtainable. While the player is unable to take the quiz in the English game, it's actually translated and present within the French, Spanish, and German versions' data, and simply goes unused. These versions changed the quiz substantially, as Robotrek, known in Japan as Slapstick, never had a release in Europe, although plans had been made for it. As a result, the French and German versions of this quiz changed the solution to the questions that reference Robotrek by replacing the entire question with Nintendo-themed queries instead. These replacements are quite funny and outright bizarre. The German quiz would ask the player to confirm true or false statements, like, in Soul Blazer, you build a city with Yoshi, or Mario's best friend is called Bowser. And in the French version, it has its own unique statements too, like, Mario wears pink underwear, and Luigi has hairy knees. In many instances, these questions are considered true when they are most certainly not, like the German translation statement of Princess Zelda is related to Mario's girlfriend Toadstool. Sticking with the RPG trend, Final Fantasy IV seems to have some unusual oversights in its code for how it calculates evasion for some enemies. In the part of the game's data that contains information on enemies' stats for attack power, physical defense, and magical defense, there are 3 values for each stat type: a multiplier for the stat, the base stat itself, and a percentage. When either defense stat is to be calculated, the game takes the percentage value, which appears to be for the chance to evade, and inserts it into the RAM address that is using the defense incorrectly, and then subsequently overwrites this value with the actual defense stat as it should. As a result of this, the game will essentially have guaranteed evasion percentage stat of 0%, and only a character's weapon or magical accuracy, their level, status, and positions within the battle can come into play when determining whether an attack or spell will land. There are only a few instances when this doesn't come into effect, mostly with monsters that have 254 defense, where they will always have a 99% chance to evade, or as part of an attack sequence that results in evasion being altered. So, all the way back in 1998, a translation group called RPGE released their English fan translation of Final Fantasy V, a project that would shake things up in the fan translation scene and the gaming scene as a whole, being touted as one of the most widely played translations ever, as well as one of the best and most influential. The team released this translation before Squaresoft's own official English translation was released as part of the Final Fantasy anthology in late 1999. Despite the team behind RPG primarily being made up of inexperienced teenagers, the fan translation was still considered to be of higher quality than that of the official publisher of the game. As such, many Western players were introduced to Final Fantasy V through this translation. RPG co-creator, Shadow, was inspired by another incomplete translation effort for Final Fantasy II that was worked on by users Demi and Some2Freak, the latter of whom provided Shadow with a set of tools to start working on translating Final Fantasy V. Shadow began his translation by making flashcards for which hex code corresponded to each Japanese or English character within the game's data. To promote the work he was doing, he would post photoshopped images of the game to represent what the translation might look like, and recruited other users to make the patch, including the other co-creator of RPG, translator David Timko, and a computer engineering major named Hui. Hui even went to work expanding the team by speaking with Japanese instructors at his university to help with translating some of the enemy names. The team's plan focused on directly editing their English script into the text files of a ROM of the Japanese version of the game. Because of the team's overall lack of experience, the work was long, slow, and tedious. They were generally out of touch with the fledgling emulation communities, resulting in a number of technical issues with their text and sprite editing software. English language characters were often displayed poorly under certain conditions, as the game was designed for the larger Japanese characters to take these positions. To top it all off, the group suffered as a result of internal factionalism, with RPG co-founder Shadow feeling the immense pressure of being the public-facing personality behind the team, topped with the attention it drew, both positive and controversial, and the level of seriousness he felt towards the work being undertaken. He saw this translation effort as a vital service towards the Squaresoft fan community. Demi, who had worked on the incomplete Final Fantasy II translation, posted a lengthy parody of Shadow, pushing him to his emotional wit's end, and resulting in his departure from RPG. The remaining founders of RPG would also, one by one, step down from the role, leaving other users to take over their efforts and start their own work. A user by the name of Miria, who had been scathing of RPG's method of hex editing, split from the original team already and had been undertaking the effort separately. Sharing similar setbacks to the team at RPG, she would arduously pass through the game's code used to handle text files, and modify them so that they would recognize English characters of varying sizes, allowing for more text to be displayed within dialogue boxes. For some time, Some2Freak helped with translating the game's script, but left after the project introduced a new editor, Harmony7, who has been heavily revising Some2Freak's translations, much to his frustration, despite his work having had several issues. One of the most controversial aspects of the translation lay with a simple choice: the main character's name. In Squaresoft's later English translation, the primary hero of the story would be given the name Bartz, but RPG's translation had given the character the name Butts, which, as you might have guessed, was kind of funny because it sounds like butts. Miria claimed that Butts was the most accurate way to translate the name based on documents and official merchandise. For reference, the romanized version of the Japanese name comes out as Batsu. Butz is a real surname in Germany, however, though it has a different pronunciation, meaning that Bartz would be a more logical choice for the name, with the vowels more closely matching the Japanese name than Butts, as well as also being closer to a German first name, with Bartz being a common nickname for people called Bartholomew. The majority of the technical work on the fan translation came to an end, with Miria finishing her efforts in October of 1997, while Harmony7 continued to work on revising the entire script. That was until something unexpected happened. An unfinished early version of the fan translation mysteriously appeared on a GeoCities website, with other users taking credit for the work carried out on it. This prompted the team at RPG to release their work up to that point as an early version of their translation, known as version 0.96, on October 17, 1997, with the final patch eventually seeing a release in June 1998. In the end, the patch was immensely well received and attained high levels of acclaim for not just the technical aspects that had been carried out, but also the highly professional writing quality that was undertaken with its translation. This translation patch is also considered to have been the starting point for many players in the fan translation scene to get involved, including Clyde Mandelin, who would later go on to be widely recognised for his work on the English fan translation of Mother 3. With everything having been completed, some expected the game's development and publishing company Squaresoft to take notice. However, the company never reached out to contact RPG about the translation, and their own translation would be published officially in 1999, with many believing it to be inferior to that of the fan translation. With that said, Miria would later put forward that she believes Square Enix's 2006 localization of the game Final Fantasy V Advance was better than their own. After their effort on this translation, Miria continued to hack and reverse engineer games, eventually landing themselves with a job at an undisclosed major video game company. Well, that was quite the tale, was it not? How about we give you one more little Final Fantasy tidbit and then we move on. Final Fantasy VI time now, and the character of Ultros. In Japan, this character's name is pronounced Otorusu, and was intended as a reference to Orthos, famed within Greek mythology. When localizing the game, however, it can be presumed that the translator was unaware of this reference and decided in a more literal translation as Ultros. Thanks to this slight oversight, all future entries in the series would alternate the name, calling the creature both Ultros and Orthos. Inspirations for names can come from anywhere: mythology, legends, or even good old classic British rock. Ogre Battle, the March of the Black Queen, took several naming cues from the famed English band Queen, who aren't just popular in their home country, nor just the English-speaking territories, but even in Japan. Their influence on the game isn't just limited to this one SNES game, but the series as a whole, with the name Ogre Battle coming from their 1973 album Queen 2. Specifically, and this may come as a shock to some of you, the song Ogre Battle. Another song from this album inspired the subtitle of this particular game too, The March of the Black Queen, another track off the same album. The references to Queen continued with the series, with the second game in the series, Let Us Cling Together, taken from Queen's 1976 track, Teo Toriate, Let Us Cling Together, a song that was created as an homage specifically to their large Japanese fanbase. Another aspect of the game's first entry lies in the name of one of the game's regions, the Ryan Sea. The name is inspired by the song Seven Seas of Rye, which first appeared as an unfinished instrumental track on Queen's debut self-titled album in 1973, later being completed with lyrics on Queen 2. While Ogre Battle never faced any issues with taking, inspiration from Queen, Mario's Super Picross decided to preempt any potential repercussions from the inclusion of some iconic imagery within their puzzle game, at least many years after its initial release, when ported over to the Virtual Console. In this re-release, the game was modified to replace 3 of the existing puzzles, one of which showed a likeness of Marilyn Monroe, now being a tortoise, a picture of Tetrominos from Tetris being replaced with a hermit crab, and lastly, a recreation of the famous painting The Scream by Edvard Munch, which has been changed into a chameleon. At the time, these items still retained their residual rights, but both The Scream and Monroe's likeness entered public domain in 2015 and 2012 respectively. Despite this, future releases of Mario's Super Picross on the Wii U, new 3DS and the Switch kept these new puzzle designs instead of reverting back to their original versions. We've all played Monopoly, right? It's quite a common practice to settle in with your family and go a few rounds of crippling debt simulator. But Monopoly actually had its own Japanese exclusive Super Famicom release produced by a rather famous individual within the retro gaming scene. It may come as a surprise to hear that leading the game's production was famed copywriter Shigesato Itoi, perhaps best known outside of Japan as the creator of the Earthbound series. A lesser known fact about the writer is that he isn't just extremely talented with his words, but he's also clearly good at handling his money, being a champion Monopoly player for one, but also the leader of the Japanese Monopoly Association. He clearly loved Monopoly so much that he was even brought on for the game's Japanese exclusive sequel, Monopoly Game 2, as a supervisor. Itoi seemed to pop his head in with Nintendo quite a bit in those days. In a promotional interview conducted by Nintendo to hype up the release of the Super NES Classic Edition micro console, Kirby Super Star's director, Masahiro Sakurai, revealed that Itoi was also involved in some small part to Super Star's release, having come up with the game's Japanese title, Kirby of the Stars Super Deluxe. But that's not all. Itoi had come up with the idea for the Japanese box art of the game, designed after Paulownia wood boxes, traditionally used as packaging for luxury alcohol or tableware in the country. Itoi believed that the title and artwork together would convey how rich the game is in content. Kirby wasn't always treated with such dignity though. For its international release, Kirby's Dream Course had to have a fairly substantial chunk of its data cut down so that it could fit onto the 8MB cartridge. For comparison, the Japanese release was on a 10MB cartridge. While some of the data that was removed wouldn't have been used by most players, such as the game's debug menu and a number of test courses that were inaccessible under normal circumstances, the title screen had a complete rework, taking out a short animation sequence of Kirby in which he would pop out of a hole with an accompanying short musical track. Though this track wasn't taken off the cartridge, still accessible in the game's sound test. What was taken out completely, however, was a full-blown introduction story to the game, which wound up only being supplied in the game's instruction manual, along with a music track that would play during this intro, which wound up being cut completely. This isn't the only Kirby game to have been altered between releases, though the next example isn't about regional variations. Kirby's Dream Land 3, besides being a beautifully illustrated adventure, was notably modified when Nintendo published the game on Virtual Console. In particular, the background clouds that appeared in the Boss Butch rematch against Dark Matter, or Zero, in which the SNES version of the game they appear blue and red, while on the Virtual Console they appear orange and green. The reason was never explicitly given for this change, but it is speculated that the reason is because of concerns of epilepsy triggers. With the clouds scrolling rapidly across the screen, the blue and red colours are highly triggering for some who suffer from seizures. This theory is given more credence when we consider another change when Zero makes his appearance, which originally included a rapid white flash on screen, which in the Virtual Console version is replaced with a slower series of grey flashes, again likely to reduce the chances of causing a reaction. Kirby's Dream Land 3 also had a secret screen that many players may have missed, only being accessible at the end of the Boss Butch mode, and even then, unearthing the screen is never explained. After defeating Zero, the player must simply press X, L and R before the screen fades to black. Doing so will cause this screen to appear in the place of the typical credits, reading "Perfect." NBA Jam stood out at release as a basketball game that, for a start, didn't actually suck. It was pretty good, but you know what makes any fine video game all that much better? Bizarre secret characters. NBA Jam has a number of these, like Al Gore or Bill Clinton among many others, but 2 characters were once planned for inclusion in the game as revealed from early video footage from the game's development. Bart Simpson and Godzilla represented the 90s phenomenally well, and their inclusion in the game is heavily suggested, with a video showing reference footage of Bart and Godzilla action figures being filmed against a blue screen. To top it off, within the game's data there are 2 colored palettes labeled as B and G, which happen to have yellow skin and green scales respectively. From a game with a top-level reputation to one that didn't exactly have a huge crowd of fans waving its freak flag. Bubsy in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Just the sound of Bubsy's name alone can cause some visceral reactions, but a few people took such distaste with the series that they actually made a concerted effort to screw with it. In 2018, Bubsy fandom Amino received a mysterious visitor under the name of Beelzebubsy, who dropped what they alleged to be an unreleased concept art drawn by Ken Macklin, Bubsy's original designer. Fans of the series immediately disputed their claim, noticing that one design in particular, a female Bubsy that was scrapped for what it purports as being too sexualized, had a close resemblance to a fan-made interpretation of the Bubsy character known as Modern Bubsy, an angsty, transgender prostitute created by Squirrely Jack, an artist who made no secret of their hatred towards Bubsy, who gained notoriety for their malicious behavior towards Bubsy fans. Further connecting this concept art with Squirrely Jack was the presence of one more prototypical design which had been inspired by Michael Jackson, another figure that Squirrely Jack was known to be a fan of, donning the same jacket worn by Jackson in the music video for Beat It, along with another future post from the same user which showed a screenshot of a Bubsy parody in the form of an RPG Maker game. The third concept art provided, however, does have a strong resemblance to a real piece of Bubsy concept art that had been shown in a magazine in the 90s, which many suggested may have been traced. Taking a look at all of the hoax concept art closely, it's fairly plain to see that the creator made a somewhat inaccurate representation of Macklin's signature, not completely matching up with the real deal. Bubsy fandom member Zindictive, who is in a Bubsy-centric Discord server with the late Bubsy creator Michael Berlin, claims that he has stated on occasion that the images were most certainly faked, along with a friend of Squirrely Jack, cementing its reputation of completely fake. With that said, the Discord server where these communications are alleged to have taken place has since closed as a result of being hacked, so confirming this evidence is indeed a tricky task. Michael Berlin had made other revelations about their distaste towards Bubsy before his passing. He claimed that the Bubsy 2 designer, Cindy Kirkpatrick, had a vehement hatred towards Bubsy, to the point of sticking pencils through the heads of rare promotional Bubsy dolls, which would be hanged from nooses and covered in fake blood. Berlin said that this continued hate towards the character ultimately had an effect on the quality of the final game in his view, saying, "The art wasn't quite right, the feeling wasn't quite right, and they did some weird things with secondary characters and the biplanes, nothing really worked for me." Rumours even circulated for a time that Rob Paulson, the voice actor for the titular Bobcat in Bubsy 2, Fractured Furry Tales, and the 1993 cartoon pilot for the series, hated the character as well, and that he held regrets over taking on the gig. Paulson has since stated that that rumour is unfounded and that he doesn't regret the role at all, even saying that he would happily voice the character again in any future Bubsy project if he was paid to do so. Bubsy 2 didn't receive a subtitle, unlike the first game, but there were working titles for the game which wound up going unused. Initial ideas were Bubsy 2 Still No Pants and Bubsy 2 Lost in the Amazatorium. One gaming mascot who gained a touch more fame and reputation than Bubsy was Pac-Man, who had a number of sequels to the standard arcade game which expanded the series into new genres, like Pac in Time. It seems as though this game was perhaps going to be a bit more mature in nature than the final release, where in the SNES version, Pac-Man is cut straight through and hit by a saw blade. What isn't seen, however, is that this graphic is made up of two pieces, so the blade can appear to go through the hero, with the rightmost half having an unseen portion of flesh and bone, suggesting that the animation would have been a more visceral, sword in half appearance. Pack Attack was another popular adventure for the pill-popping pizza protagonist, released in late 1993. But the game wasn't always a Pac-Man title. It actually began life as a 1992 arcade game called Cosmo Gang the Puzzle, a title that also had a release on the Super Famicom in Japan. The original game was modified so much as to make it into a Pac-Man centric game with completely overhauled art, characters, menus, and even modifications to the actual gameplay. Namco held a contest to promote its release in Game Fan magazine, with players contributing scores in order to win prizes, with the grand prize being a gift certificate to the value of $500. When the game was released to European players on the Game Boy, Mega Drive and CDI, it was actually renamed under the title of Pac Panic. Modifications to the original SNES release were also made when it was bundled into 2022's Pac-Man Museum Plus compilation, where it was available as an unlockable extra. Despite the game being a simple emulated version of the original release, the game was modified to replace the characters of Miss Pac-Man and Baby Pac-Man, who simply appeared on the game's high score tables as cameos. In this re-release, they were removed in favour of Pac-Mom and Pac-Sis, new characters added within this collection. The reason for this change has never been officially stated, but it has been widely assumed that the reason is in relation to ongoing legal battles with Miss Pac-Man and AtGames. Pac-Man has 1,000 games under his belt, but one iconic character of the SNES era, at least to us, was Plock. Similar to Pac-Man though, Plock began life in a completely different state, originally being envisaged as a coin-operated arcade game called Flea Pit. Flea Pit would have run off Rare's Raz board, a piece of hardware that would wind up never being used in any commercially released game. Chris Seavey, famed for his role as popular 80s UK comedy character Frank Sidebottom, had initially agreed to portray the voice of Plock in Flea Pit, before the game was ultimately cancelled. The SNES game wound up not having any voice acting in the end, aside from the typical synthesized grunts and laughter. Another cut was made to Plock, with the game initially being set to include an item shop which would have been run by an anime-esque character known as Suki. Plock creators John and Steve Pickford wound up not using the character in Plock, but they did keep her in mind for potential future installments that may have been made, which wound up never being brought to fruition. Steve has claimed that he was actually happy in the end that Suki never made an appearance in the Plock game though, as he felt that any Western attempts to replicate anime style has rarely, if ever, turned out well. Another truly unforgettable NES title was the Tim Allen-centric 2D platformer Home Improvement Power Tool Pursuit. Obviously based on the TV show Home Improvement, Power Tool Pursuit was the second game Disney commissioned Absolute Entertainment to produce, with the first title being 1993's Goofy's Hysterical History Tour for the Sega Genesis. Power Tool Pursuit was apparently also supposed to be released on the Genesis, but that version was canned and only the SNES version ever saw release. And when it did come out, the game had a unique surprise in its manual that threw many gamers through a loop. Power Tool Pursuit's manual is a bit of a bait and switch, being only 6 pages in total, with a giant sticker obscuring informative text on pages 4 and 5, which reads, "Real men don't need instructions." This was intended as a joke in line with the humour of the original TV series, but the manual's been posted online frequently over the years without the additional context that the game actually came with an additional poster stylized as a blueprint which had many hints and tips for the game. The last 2 sentences in the bottom right corner of the manual even reference the poster saying, "Although it's frowned upon by the most macho of the breed, some real men prefer the blueprints for help. If you find yourself in need of, dare we say it, instructions, you'd better refer to the enclosed poster blueprints for hints." Though Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 released on just about every platform it could at the time, the Super Nintendo version has some interesting unused details within its data. This version of the game removed Shiva in an effort to crunch the game down so it would fit on an SNES cartridge. However, the character wasn't removed entirely, as evidenced by a glitch. As noted on the cutting room floor, if the player holds down the L and R buttons on the title screen, then presses Start to enter the 8v8 tournament mode, then presses Up and Start to randomly select a character, there's a chance that they'll randomly select the E icon instead of a character. There's even video footage of YouTube user Thies3403 playing as Shiva, or what's left of her, in an incredibly broken manner. there's still a few bits and pieces of her art in the data, such as when her opponent takes her out with a babality and her baby sprite appears. The character Chameleon was slated for Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, but only exists in the game's data in an unfinished state. Curious players can tease Chameleon out of the data using the Pro Action Replay code, but he'll have Rain's name, Scorpion's appearance and moveset, but absolutely no special moves or fatalities. One truly beautiful game for the Super Nintendo was Squaresoft's 1995 masterpiece, Trials of Mana, which was infamous for the longest time for never being released outside of Japan, where it was titled Seiken Densetsu 3. That was until 2020 when the game received a 3D remake for modern systems and a worldwide release to boot. But we're here to talk about the SNES original, which just so happens to have a fair amount of cut content and odd leftovers from development. By modifying 2 bytes of data in the game's ROM, an entirely new way to play the game is revealed, where instead of just playing with one other person and a CPU companion, they can play with 2 other humans for 3 human players total. The fact that this mode is so easy to re-enable seems to suggest that Square was planning for the 3-player support to return from the previous titles in the series, Secret of Mana. In fact, in December 2006, a patch was released that modified the ROM and let players go through the game in a group of 3 with no CPU companion. The Cutting Room Floor wiki speculates that the mode may have been disabled due to bugs that Square weren't able to resolve before the game's release, but this has yet to be confirmed. Back when Seiken Densetsu 3 released, it was pretty standard procedure for publishers to send out test cartridges to publications so that they could preview the game. And within Seiken Densetsu 3's test cart, an entire unused boss battle can be found. On Buka Island, where the players usually encounter Malokio, or Jagan in the fan translation, there's a squid boss not seen in the final game. The boss is partly submerged underwater, and as you might expect, attacks the players with its tentacles. Now, for our final game of this video. Theme Park was a popular port of the simulation game that brought salty fries and vomit to the masses. The original Theme Park game is quite notorious for the screen that displays if the player falls victim to bankruptcy, where it is alluded that, presumably the player, commits suicide as a result of their financial struggles. A shadowy figure is seen jumping from a windowsill while the funeral march song plays, shown entirely in the reflection of a family photo, before the figure peeks back through the window, suggesting that they may have had second thoughts, or that the jump was not big enough for it to cause their death. The game's manual even suggests as much as the result of the player hitting bankruptcy, where the consequences of bankruptcy are described as the park has to close, your life's work collapses around you, and there's only one honorable way out. It's a long way down. When the game was ported over to consoles, the cutscene was altered, where it would now be shown as a still image, lacking the tongue-in-cheek conclusion and making it appear even more so as though the character had indeed actually committed suicide. Different ports had a few different variations of this screen, with the SNES version adding in a cartoon crying sound effect. Thank you for watching the video. Sleep well if you're asleep, and if you're not, congrats on making it to the end. I will leave you with my favourite track from the 7th Saga. Good night, everyone.